I'd like to illustrate something about non-self by a reading from the book. In 1911, a 32-year-old sportsman and daredevil called Calbraith Perry Rogers, with a scant 60 hours of airtime in his logbook, set off to cross the United States from coast to coast in his specially modified Wright airplane, the first in private ownership. His dream was to win the $50,000 that tycoon publisher William Randolph Hearst had offered to the first person to fly across the continent within 30 days. But Rogers, as much a canny businessman as an adventurous pioneer, had a financial backup plan in case the trip took longer than the allotted month. He'd persuaded J. Ogden Armour, a Chicago entrepreneur, to underwrite the costs of the mission in exchange for the words Vin Fizz, Armour's brand of grape-flavoured soda, being emblazoned on the craft's tail fin and wings. I believe Vin Fizz is actually available in Portsmouth. I saw it in the store there. And so the Vin Fizz Flyer became the name of Rogers' airplane. The Vin Fizz took to the air from a field in Sheepshead Bay near New York City late on the afternoon of September the 17th. Its pilot swaddled in layers of sweaters and sheepskin to provide warmth in the unheated cockpit. 7 weeks and almost 70 landings later, the craft touched down at a racetrack in Pasadena, California. Sadly, Rogers failed to win Hearst's prize. For all his courage and persistence, his flight had taken far longer than the 30 days allowed, and as a further blow to Rogers' hopes, the year-long window for participating in the competition had expired before the Vin Fizz reached Pasadena. But a week later, buoyed by the glory of having made aviation history with his epic voyage, Rogers set off to cover the remaining 20 miles to Long Beach and the Pacific Ocean. In retrospect, this was not such a good idea. The last leg alone took almost a month, with 2 crashes, one of which was serious enough to cause a broken ankle, all for a distance that could be comfortably cycled in 2 hours. Although Rogers didn't win Hearst's $50,000, his having crossed the country in such a primitive aircraft was an astonishing achievement. The Vin Fizz was a fragile thing made from a spruce frame covered with linen, its body looking more like a box kite than a modern plane. It was powered by a tiny 35 horsepower engine, no more powerful than some modern lawnmowers. Rogers had no navigational instruments, and he found his way across the country by the simple expedient of following a train, which also pulled a white boxcar packed with spare parts for the journey. And Rogers was to need a lot of spares. The doughty Vin Fizz malfunctioned, crashed, or was damaged in rough landings so many times during the 84-day crossing that by the end of the journey, only 1 wing strut and a rudder remained from the original machine that had left New York. Without in any way undermining the magnificence of Rogers' achievement, when I first heard this tale many years ago, I found myself wondering in what sense the Vin Fizz had actually completed the journey. Only 2 components survived the trip, and given a few more miles, it's possible that even those remaining original parts would have been replaced from the dwindling supply of spares in the White Railroad car, in which case nothing would have remained of the original craft. In a sense, 1 plane took off from Sheepshead Bay and another landed in California. With each repair, the machine had become, in a sense, a new aircraft. The Vin Fizz struck me as being a perfect example of the Buddhist teaching of anatta, or the non-permanence and insubstantiality of the self. Compressing time and space in the theatre of the imagination, let's visualise the cross-country flight of the Vin Fizz. Let's see the frail craft at the midpoint of each of its hops, suspended mid-air, the images strung together to form a brief movie. Squeezing the entire journey into the space of a minute or less, notice that the craft is continually changing. In a sudden jump of perception, a tattered wing becomes whole again, a rattling bolt falls to earth, and at that same moment is replaced. A propeller, a wing strut, a stretch of linen, a wheel, an entire engine, each vanishes and is instantaneously regenerated. As we watch the Vin Fizz in this way, it's a plane forever in the process of becoming another plane. And when at last we visualise the final touchdown, only that stubborn wing strut and hardy rudder remain unchanged. And we can, if we wish, imagine one more frame of this imaginary movie and see even those components being replaced. So what was it that flew across the United States? What was the Vin Fizz? The craft that had arrived in Pasadena was not physically the same one that had departed New York. The form was the same, the name was the same, but almost everything constituting the aircraft had changed. No one component was the Vin Fizz. No single component contained the essence of the aircraft, certainly not the wing strut and rudder that happened to survive the journey, and which were merely accidental survivors. The Vin Fizz was also not the entirety of its components, since they were forever changing. When we try to look for the Vin Fizz, it becomes mirage-like, its thingness vanishing under scrutiny. The Vin Fizz clearly existed, but it was a process rather than a thing, an ever-changing assemblage of parts functioning in a particular way, not a static object. It was a process that had continuity rather than identity. It had no essence, but consisted of a series of ever-changing components brought together in a manner that allowed an ever-changing form to cross a continent. What arrived in Pasadena was not identical to what left Sheepshead Bay, but there was a continuous process connecting the craft's various iterations as it evolved over the course of its journey. The continuity of the Vin Fizz is also maintained in the mind. Had the Vin Fizz suffered only one devastating crash halfway between coasts, and had a new craft been assembled from the parts in the railroad car, including only one wing strut and a rudder from the original aircraft, and continued the journey, would Rogers be credited with the first continental crossing by air? Naturally not. We would not have believed that one craft made the crossing. It would seem like a stunt had been pulled. And yet an assemblage of replacement parts, including one wing strut and a rudder from the original aircraft, was precisely what did arrive on the west coast. What held together the Vin Fizz as much as the rivets and bolts was the sense of continuity that the mind sees, which allows us to say that a process had continually functioned as an aircraft, despite modifications. When we look for a thing called the Vin Fizz, it now seems mirage-like and undefinable. The same is true of the human body. As the body makes a journey across the continent of life, from the coast of conception to the far shore we call death, it too is continually changing, the physical and mental components forever being replaced. What arrives at the final touchdown is a far cry from what originally departed at the beginning of life. The body you're born with is not the one you'll die with. Looking at the body the same way we did the Vin Fizz, we can see there's similarly no essence within it. There's no locus within the body where a self can be found. Our physical selves seem mirage-like, held together not so much by chemical bonds, but by a physical process of continuity and an idea of selfhood. Read just a little bit more. Our ideas of what constituted the boundaries of the Vin Fizz are also limited. At some point after its historic flight, the Vin Fizz was broken up, its parts dispersed to rot or burn. We no longer have the sense that there is a thing or process we can label Vin Fizz, and yet the continuity has simply taken a different form. Parts of the aircraft, the ash from burned wood and linen, metal parts that long ago turned to rust, have become soil, supporting manifold forms of life. The carbon dioxide from its burning has become plants, which have since been eaten and transformed into uncountable living things. Just a few years before it crossed the United States, the Vin Fizz had not yet come into being. It was trees, flax, soil, and ores buried deep underground. We could look at these things and never dream that they would one day fly across a vast continent. When we look in this way, we could see that there was no beginning to the Vin Fizz, nor was there an end to it. But the mind tries to impose boundaries on processes that in essence are boundless. We think of the Vin Fizz beginning and ending. We see the craft in the air as being the Vin Fizz, but the components on the train as not being the Vin Fizz. We impute to the Vin Fizz a false sense of separateness. We also impute the same false sense of separateness to ourselves, and the purpose of reflecting on the elements is to dispel the mistaken assumption that the self is a thing, static, separate, and enduring. The purpose of reflecting on the elements is to see the truth of flow, of impermanence, of insubstantiality, and of interconnectedness. And on the way to seeing this truth, we have to let go of the idea that the body is a thing, that it is separate and has some kind of permanent essence. When we do that, we start to realise that we can't own the body. The body is not ours in any real sense, nor is the body us in any real sense. The self cannot be found within it. This, as we'll see, isn't to diminish ourselves. Rather, is to free ourselves from a limited way of seeing the self, so that we can appreciate that we're much, much more than we habitually assume.